Thanks, everyone. And now I will hand over to Matt to talk us through his section. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Guy, and thank you very much to Anna as well for the invitation to talk today. Unfortunately, as you could probably tell already, I'm full of the cold, so hopefully you won't need the subtitles today. As I say, the presentation will be sent afterwards, and if you need any links or further information, just get in touch afterwards. So my name is Matt Jackson. I work within the Net Zero Transport team at Scottish Futures Trust. We are an organisation that's wholly owned by Scottish ministers. We work across the public sector and private sector, as well as government itself, to try and encourage private finance into infrastructure and also to deliver the best outcomes as well for Scotland. We've been involved in EV infrastructure for probably the last 18 to 20 months now, and we're really getting into the thick of sort of developing business cases with local authorities as part of Scotland's EV Infrastructure Fund, which operates quite similarly to Levi that's already been talked about today. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to talk to you today is specifically about tariffs. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't part of the earlier presentations, but tariffs is actually a sort of crucial point, particularly within Scotland, where the way in which infrastructure has been delivered by the public sector has effectively enabled lots of free or cheap public charging, which is counterintuitive when we're trying to get the private sector to provide funding and financing for infrastructure. So within Scotland, up to now, we have about 3,700 publicly available charge points, and that's spread across about 2,100 locations. Compared to the rest of the UK, these figures are quite strong, but when we start looking at the numbers, realise that about 2/3 of that provision has actually come directly from the public sector, and a large portion of that has been 100% capital grants, which is fantastic for the end consumer like you and I that want to drive our EV. But like I say, when we're trying to get private investment into Scotland, that can be quite difficult. Some local authorities have quite a lot of private provision, and others, sort of not to name a few, but some of the islands and more remote authorities have no private provision at all, which does sort of provide a bit of an issue. Next slide, please. So the reason I wanted to sort of share that intelligence is that we're at a point in time now where we are at the tipping point in terms of EV uptake. I'm sure a lot of you have seen in the press recently that despite cost of living pressures and so forth, EV uptake remains particularly strong. Now we're at that point in time where we need to look at the infrastructure to support that. And the age of 100% capital grants from the public sector is at an end now. We are reliant on the private sector and private finance to be able to deliver the vast majority of what public infrastructure is required in Scotland. And from the previous slide, you're able to understand that in Scotland that is quite difficult for us because, as I say, 2/3 of the total provision up until now has come from the public sector. So with all our local authority partners, there's a bit of a cultural shift that is required, and that's where we are supporting things. Next slide, please. So this is quite a detailed slide. I won't dwell on it too much, but you'll be able to sort of have a look into this after the call. But back in November, we did an exercise looking at what tariffs look like across Scotland and across the UK. And when we're looking at local authorities in Scotland and you compare the level of tariffs, so that's what you and I would be charged for per kilowatt hour on a charge point, the costs are significantly different across both destination charging, so 7 to 22 kilowatt AC, and journey chargers as well. And that is, these figures have increased in the time since this analysis has taken place. If we can skip the next slide, please. And you can see when we look at the same statistics, looking at pence per mile as well, despite the tariffs that are in place, it's still broadly in line with and cheaper than driving a internal combustion engine vehicle. But you can imagine that the pressures that are in place, particularly for the private sector, with the market rate currently for a rapid charger at about 79 pence a kilowatt hour. It is getting quite close to being a lot more potentially more expensive than internal combustion vehicles, particularly when the petrol and diesel prices come down. So we just need to err on the side of caution and ensure that we build a sustainable network that is able to that you're able to maintain and operate effectively. Because I think the last thing we all want is to rock up to a charge point and it's not working. So we need to make sure we're able to sort of look after the network effectively. Next slide, please. So when we look at the situation within Scotland, I think it's clear that there are some negative impacts of sort of free charging or some market rate tariffs. I think that the first one is that it primarily benefits those that don't need to be subsidised. So we find, looking at the data, that unfortunately a lot of people that are making use of the free or cheap charging were those that already had a charger at home, bought an expensive electric vehicle, charged it. They could have charged it at home, but obviously, why would you if you had a free charge point a few hundred meters from your front door? So that was an issue. It still is an issue in some areas, but with the introduction of tariffs in line with market rate, it is helping. And also, we want to make sure that the existing network is optimized, because with free or cheap tariffs, it's not. Again, looking at the data, the dwell time on charge points was significantly higher than those that had a commercial tariff in place, especially those that didn't have any overstay fees. So in terms of making the most effective use of the network, in terms of financially and operating the network, it was sort of counterintuitive. Next slide, please. And just the point as well about sort of EV users, I think this is quite stark actually. So this came from a study through OZEV in April last year. Again, I'll send you all the link to this afterwards. Effectively, there was a survey of just a little less than 1,000 EV drivers, and it was really just to try and understand how to use the network. And one of the questions was, what is your income? And you can see here that it's pretty much dominated by those that earn high incomes. So we need to understand that when we want to try and subsidise the network and ensure that all those have access to it, actually having a blanket tariff that is either free or cheap is actually counterintuitive, because that money that the sort of subsidising the cheap tariffs are effectively going into the pockets of those that don't actually require it. So I would implore to you as a sort of local authority that if you're looking to sort of create a tariff that's sustainable, that it will allow you to look after your network and operate it effectively, that you look at ways in which you can have a subsidised tariff for those that are on lower incomes. You might want to base it on those that don't have access to a driveway or a charge point at home. You might want to do it by council tax bands. But I think that rather than having a blanket subsidised tariff, I think it needs to be a lot more targeted. Next slide, please. So we actually had a publication back in November of last year, which Diana got in touch with me originally, and it was some insights into this tariff situation in Scotland, and I'll put the link in the chat just now for those that wish to read it. So the summary of the Insights report is that 45% of the ChargePlay Scotland network is still free to use. And from a local authority point of view, that was around 370,000 free sessions that were provided, which was a lost revenue of £2.5 million. Now, this was 2021. So you can imagine now, nearly 2 years later, that that lost revenue and number of free sessions has grown exponentially. So again, when you're looking at your own business cases, you want to take that into account. I think engagement with the private sector up here in Scotland has made it clear that tariffs, particularly on the destination charge point side, that has been a barrier to their own investment. I mean, it's fairly obvious. You can't really compete with free or cheap. It would make more sense where other areas might benefit from it more. And I think just one thing I'd like to sort of end this section on is that we can support a just transition and have fair and enabling tariffs. This is all about creating a sustainable network that is well operated, that delivers good outcomes for consumers. I think that a message that we've been given to all local authorities in Scotland is that you need to now look at a market rate tariff to expand that high quality network across all of Scotland. And I think that's really important. Next slide, please. So we had 3 recommendations. I'm not going to dwell on them too much, as you'll be able to read them for yourselves. But again, we suggested that all ChargePlace Scotland ChargePoint owners should now focus on delivering these tariffs that align with market rate. Again, you could do this the bottom-up approach, which is focusing on your costs. What are the costs to replace the assets, to operate the assets? What was the financing cost for the assets in the first place? For a lot of local authorities, it's zero, but it won't be in the future. There will be costs for getting the private sector in to deploy these charge points, and that all needs to be factored in. Next slide, please. Our second recommendation is to recognise the benefits of flexible and off-peak tariffs. I'm quite happy to say that there's a couple of local authorities in Scotland that are looking at this. There's been some fantastic trials across the UK. Some of them have been looking at ways in which off-peak tariffs can help those that don't have access to off-street parking at home, being able to access much cheaper electricity overnight. And I think that does reduce the inequality of those that do have access and those that don't have access to ChargePoint at home. Next slide, please. And yes, I think the final one, I think this is probably a bit of a boring one, but important nonetheless, is that local authorities should consider delegated authority. So rather than having to go back through all the local authority governance and governance structures to try and change the tariffs, could that be delegated to a director or someone that sits directly and that leads on EV infrastructure in your local area? So I think that being able to get that delegated authority will certainly help respond to market forces, changes in electricity prices, warranties, maintenance, that sort of thing, which is all really important. Next slide, please. I think this is just some ministerial feedback that we got from Mrs. Jenny Gilruth, MSP, who is the Transport Minister in Scotland, effectively saying that it's vital that the ChargePoint network has tariffs which are fair and sustainable, and enables the private sector to invest, which hopefully I've demonstrated the need for today. I think I've got just a couple more slides. And again, the Agile Streets case study, I think if you've not read it already, I would definitely give it a read. I think it suggests that there's significant savings to be had by adopting sort of smarter, more agile tariffs on your public EV charging network. I know some private ChargePoint operators are exploring this and even deploying smarter tariffs now. So I'd definitely give that a read, and again, there'll be sources in there too. Next slide, please. And that is me. So my email and my contact details are there as well. I'll be more than happy to have further discussion, and I'll also be around for the Q&A at the end.
That's really great, Matt. That was fantastic, and not a hint of hearing your heavy cold that you warned about. So well done.
It's all the Lemsip that I've been drinking, guys.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say now you can mainline Lemsip for the rest of the day. Right, really appreciated. We'll come back to some questions. There's always a few, already a few which are popping up in the chat. Just to remind people, if they've got questions for any of our speakers, we'll have some time at the end where we'll put some questions to a few of them. But the previous speakers are doing absolutely some incredible heavy lifting, answering some of the questions. Hugh in particular is doing a great job on there, so it's all being picked up.